Opinion of Oil on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours tonight. We'd like to thank you so much for being with us today. We're extremely grateful for your continued support. We'd also like to thank our partners at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network for co-sponsoring this event. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to tonight's speakers. David Goodrich, the author of Voyage Across an Ancient Ocean, A Bicycle Journey Through the Northern Dominion of Oil, is a distinguished climate scientist. He's the former director of the Climate Change Observations Division for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He also served as director of the UN Global Climate Observing System in Geneva, Switzerland. Following his retirement from NOAA in 2011, David decided to go on a bicycle trip from Delaware to Oregon, looking at the effects of climate change along the way. He wrote about this experience in his book, A Hole in the Wind. Shortly after recovering from this epic endeavor, David set out on another long-distance bike ride, this time motivated by an urgent desire to see up close and personal the sites in North America most significantly contributing to climate change. David traveled from the oil sands in Alberta, Canada, to Bakken in North Dakota, which is one of the biggest fracking fields in the United States. During this journey, he traversed the Western Interior Seaway, an ancient ocean that once spanned half of North America. He shares the stories and lessons from this adventure in his latest book. And our moderator for tonight's event is Mike Tidwell, the founder and director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, a grassroots nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about the impacts and solutions associated with global warming in the DMV area. Mike Tidwell is also an author and filmmaker whose documentary, We Are All Smith Islanders, showcases how global warming is affecting the Chesapeake Bay region. Before we welcome our speakers on screen, we have a short video for you that will give you a little context behind the book.
There's no audio.
No audio.
Sorry about that. The audio is playing on my end, so I'm not sure why it's not working. Let's see. Let's try one more time.
That's good.
More volume.
Turn up the volume.
right, and now please welcome David Goodrich and Mike Tidwell to PNP Live.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney. And Dave, good to see you there in
Very good to see
Rockville.
you.
How are you?
Very good.
It is so great to be here at PNP. And before we get to Dave and his amazing book, which is really an incredible read, I just wanted to thank Politics and Prose for nearly 40 years. That bookstore now in multiple locations, but I think many of us who've been here for a long time really know it by the Connecticut Avenue sort of anchor store. For almost 40 years, Politics and Prose has been truly a bastion for free speech and the deep exchange of ideas. And we can't help but remember almost exactly 4 years ago that PNP's neighbor on Connecticut Avenue, Comet Pizza, was actually attacked by a crazy conspiracy theorist who shot up the place, or almost. And, we see now 4 years later of all the riotous actions that we saw on January 6th of this year. To me, one of the most haunting images was of rioters stomping on the cameras of journalists and attacking journalists, attacking free speech. So now more than ever, we know that our neighborhood bookstore, like Politics and Prose, being there, the free exchange of ideas, highlighting authors like Dave Goodrich, who you're going to hear tonight, is just so vital. And we survived 2020. We survived the last 4 years. We're here. We got some big news from the president yesterday on climate change. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Politics and Prose. And I also wanted to welcome Dave. The book is amazing, A Voyage Across the Ancient Ocean. And Dave, you bicycle 100, and by the way, I'm Mike Tidwell again, director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and Dave is actually on the board of directors of CCAN. Dave, in this book, you bicycle 1,100 miles from the godforsaken tar sands of Alberta to the oil fields, fracking fields of North Dakota. You know, most people, cyclists, retirees, take a casual ride along the California coast or through the tulip fields of Holland, but you make this journey. And in the book, you say that you could not find any evidence, any record of any other cyclist who had ever made this same 1,100-mile journey through this part of North America. Is that correct?
There was a group of young cyclists that actually rode from Edmonton to the tar sands, but I couldn't find anyone who's actually gone across Alberta, Saskatchewan, North Dakota to the Bakken field. So as far as I could tell, maybe first time.
The only one truly crazy enough. Well, I'm going to hand it over to you, Dave, to give your presentation. I know that yesterday, our new president, Joe Biden, rejected by executive order a permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. And I know that would have carried tar sands oil from exactly the region of Canada where you began this trip. And so it's an auspicious week. This is an auspicious moment. And there's never been a better moment to hear your story of your bike ride. So with no further delay, I present to you Dave Goodrich, author of the book, A Voyage Across an Ancient Ocean.
Mike, thanks very much. And one of the reasons I've been involved with Chesapeake Climate Action Network for so long is that it is probably the most, or it is the most effective regional climate organization there is, and does a remarkable job. I'd also like to put in my bit for Politics and Prose, especially because the first book that I wrote, I presented at Politics and Prose, and one of the things they do on the in-person presentations back in the ready room, they have these. They have actual Politics and Prose M&Ms that you get, and I still have my bag. It's the green one says so many books, and the purple ones say so little time. So I wouldn't dare eat one right now. It'd probably break a tooth. But when you've come to Politics and Prose, it's like, wow, you're in the big time. I also wanted to thank Richard Spano. The musical piece that was written that accompanied that video is called Stewards of the Prairie, which is the title of one of the chapters in the book. I think I've heard that for concerts, you don't want to be upstaged by the opening act. So it was certainly a risk for me. It's a beautiful instrumental. I wish I had it when I was riding across the prairie. It would have seemed so much more majestic. I'm going to show some pictures and do some readings as we go along. Mike mentioned the one second here. Mike mentioned the Keystone Pipeline that was canceled as of yesterday in one of what seemed like the quieter moments of the inauguration. 10 years ago, we were marching around the Capitol with a plastic pipeline, marching around the White House. It has been a big deal for a while. I want to show you why this was such a big deal. I started out, this is the Alberta oil sands, the tar sands. This is a photograph of the source region for the Keystone XL pipeline. And when I went up there with the bike, I chartered a plane to fly over it because you can really only appreciate it from the air. The little things you see here are dump trucks that are the largest in the world. It is really quite an operation, quite a wasteland. You're way up in the boreal forest, about the same latitude as Hudson Bay. The trees are all gone, and what you have are these trucks going back and forth. The oil gets effectively boiled out of the tar sands with chemicals, and this is the third largest oil deposit in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, and easily the dirtiest one from a climate perspective. It takes about 30% of the energy that you use to make to get the oil out of the sands to actually make it. Think about melting tar in 40 below winters in Alberta, which happens all the time. So this was in the category of spectacularly dumb ideas, but I decided I wanted to ride from, as Mike said, from the tar sands to the Bakken. This was the rig that I used, with a shout out to my alma mater, Dartmouth. I had panniers in the front and rear. This is the full rig that included camping gear. For the actual ride down from Alberta, I managed to get rid of these two front panniers because I was going to be staying in motels the whole time. And I thought, well, maybe I should bring camping gear. And the guy later told me that that wasn't going to be a good idea. And I said, well, I know all about hanging food for bears. And he said, that's not what I'd be worried about. I think it'd be more like the wolves. It's like, oh, wolves. So you have real wolves there. It's like there is this qualitative difference between hanging food and being food. This is the route that I took from, this is the region of the oil sands, the tar sands, Fort McMurray, Alberta, riding down through the forest, which is ends right about there, then across the prairie through Saskatoon, Regina, and into, this is the Bakken oil fields, and to Dickinson, North Dakota, which is also where Theodore Roosevelt National Park is. Well, more on this in a bit. It's about 1,100 miles.
Dave, I
yes.
wonder if your microphone seems to be really sensitive. It's picking up. I wonder if you might just go with computer sound. I don't know, or it just seems to be picking up a lot of static. So maybe just switch to computer sound.
Hang on a second. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, if you want to get a little closer to the computer. We definitely lost the static, but you're a little fainter. But I think that's an overall improvement.
Okay, thanks. It was probably rubbing against my shirt. Thanks, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the reason we're concerned about all of these oil deposits is that has pretty well been demonstrated that the planet's warming and doing so at an increasing rate, and that human activity, and particularly the combustion of fossil fuels, is the principal cause of the warming. And that includes increasing fires. One of the biggest fires, biggest natural disasters in Canadian history happened right around here at Fort McMurray. More on that in a couple of minutes. So the question is, could I ride to where climate change is coming from? Before I started from Fort McMurray, I did a tour of the oil sands, this area around Fort McMurray, including some photographs that I took of the oil sands from the air. Here's another shot of a tailings pond. They call them ponds, but actually these are some of the biggest man-made structures on the planet. When they boil and use chemicals to get the oil out of the sands, the water that they use has to settle out for a period of better than a year. And these create these giant ponds. They're actually some of the largest man-made structures on the planet. The scale here is really quite remarkable. It looks just as spooky from the ground. This is an oil sands processing facility north of Fort McMurray, where I rode around to take a look. And here is a look. It's actually quite a beautiful photograph that was not taken by me. This was taken 2 years before I was there, May 4th, 2016. And they refer to this as the beast. I'd like to give you a little reading from the book, from the third chapter. When I was growing up, Smokey Bear was all over TV. He was a big, deep-voiced bear, urging you to douse campfires and snuff out matches. He would point his finger at you from the screen, giving his catchphrase, "Only you can prevent forest fires." I believed absolutely. If you can't trust a bear in a ranger hat, who can you trust? Well, Smokey lied. Not completely, but the origin of many fires has nothing to do with humans. In Canada, lightning starts 45% of all fires, and these fires represent 81% of the area burned. Still, when it gets hot enough and dry enough and windy enough, almost anything will start a fire. Maybe one of Smokey's misplaced matches, or heat from a motorcycle muffler, or sparks from a railroad, or lightning. The point is, it doesn't really matter how it starts. Climate change is getting things plenty warm. If you heat popcorn on a stove, there's no way to predict which kernel will get things going, but one will. On May 1st, 2016, in the heat and the drought, something popped 12 miles north of Fort McMurray. What preceded that little wisp of white smoke is anyone's guess. The conflagration that ensued became variously known as the Horse Creek Fire, or the Wood Buffalo Fire, or Fire 9. But in Fort McMurray, they just know it as the beast. Did Fort McMurray's business have something to do with Fort McMurray's tragedy? At the Oil Sands Discovery Center, which is the local museum in town, they make the point that this is the third biggest oil deposit on the planet. It's hard to make that case while simultaneously maintaining that the oil sands are an infinitesimal part of the climate change problem. Simply put, carbon, of which the oil sands are a huge source, is a primary driver of climate change, the very thing that set up the boreal forest to burn. It's not karma, it's physics. The only way to slow the warming, the droughts, and the fires is to reduce our production and consumption of fossil fuels and to shift to renewable sources of energy. Ultimately, humans hold the key to slowing this down. Only you. I think about a bear pointing out from a TV commercial. Maybe Smokey was right after all. So, getting back to the road, or getting on the road, I loaded up the bike and I rolled past this sign on the outskirts of Fort McMurray, which sort of gave me a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. No gas and services next 200 kilometers. I figured I had better have my act pretty well together. So for the next 200 kilometers, I was staying at the man camps, at the facilities next to the oil operations in the boreal forest heading south. One of the was a pretty hard road. It's quite isolating. I had some amazing acts of grace for me on the road. This was a description of a day 3 days out from Fort McMurray. Thunderheads began to build from the west as I started into 15 miles of steady climbing. I tried to outrun a particularly dark. My shoulder watched the rags fall and close on me. In minutes, crackling right over my head, lightning rippling through the sky. The bike was the only metal around, so I got away from it and sat down low in the rough stubble of roadside grass. Looking into the distance, the forest seemed to be out of focus. Rather, it was blurred behind the gray edge of the rain front moving ominously up the road. I zipped up my jacket to my chin and braced as sheets of water swept over me. I began to shake. The rain started to bounce. I pulled my knees to my chest to stay warm, shivering, watching as ice pellets gathered in the folds of my wind pants. Then a different noise. I turned my head to the sound of crunching gravel. In the middle of the tempest, an SUV pulled up and its window rolled down. A crust of ice remained where the bottom of the window had been. The driver, a young mom, leaned over her elementary school-age daughter in the front seat. "You want a place to warm up?" she shouted. "I'm pretty wet," I yelled between the lightning flashes. "That's fine, come on in." She turned to the girl. "Okay, in the back seat, now." The girl squeezed between the seats, not pleased to be shoehorned between her two little brothers. Outside, I shook off like a spaniel and then opened the door and got in. I took a first good look at my savior. She had short blonde hair and tiny stud earrings, too small for an infant to grab. She was in crowd control mode. "Stop kicking the seat," she growled at her daughter. "It's because he was kicking me," was the response. The mom shot a look and then turned at me. "Are you the cyclist who rode down from Fort McMurray?" "How did you know?" "There's a grapevine out there. A friend at the settlement told me about some guy riding through who didn't look local. I was driving right through this mess when I saw you. I'm Jesse." She offered me coffee from her thermos. I'm very picky about my coffee, cream and just the tiniest amount of sugar. Hope it's okay. It was the best I ever had. "So how'd you end up out here?" she asked. "Heard a lot about the oil development here from down in the States where I live," I said. "Thought I'd come through and see it firsthand, and I ride my bike a lot." "My papa was a bus driver," she said, "up at Fort McMurray, so we grew up around it. The land is sick up there. We've done protest walks around the tar sands. Sometimes we didn't get a canoe in." She paused to look as the storm clouds began to show breaks. "A lot of changes around here too. I remember going and jumping in our lake, and it would be clear and you could see the bottom and see fish swimming. It's a mess now. I'm afraid my kids are going to think this is all normal." I mumbled something incoherent, but mostly I was focused on the wonderful stream of warmth coming out of her heater vent. The kids were getting restless. "Past their nap time," Jessie said. I could see she was looking around, trying to give me something to help me on my way. Then she reached down and gave me just what you'd expect from a mom with a van full of kids, a juice box. The sky was clearing as they drove away. Another 9 miles down the road in Spedden, I pulled into the Northern Lights truck stop and fast gas at twilight. Strung out to the side of the convenience store were the first motel rooms for 70 miles. Utterly exhausted, I went to pay at the counter. 3 people were behind me as I suddenly realized I couldn't find my wallet in the bag I'd brought in. I desperately pawed through the bag, mumbling, "I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. I'm gonna have to go look at the bike." The attendant gave me a condescending look. "Is that it?" she said. She pointed to my wallet on the shelf at eye level where I'd put it. In the room, after a shower, I had wet clothes hanging to dry from every possible hook and corner and angle in the room. The ubiquitous convenience store sandwich was warming in the microwave. It was a lonely place and the road had taken a lot out of me. Though I hardly realized it at the Northern Lights, I was on the border, the southern frontier of the boreal forest, ready to break out onto the prairie. Many hundreds of miles remained, but none so remote as what I had just passed through. I feasted on the cheap sandwich and reveled in the shelter. And on the desk sat a juice box to remind me of the afternoon's remarkable act of grace. So going across the prairie through Saskatchewan, this was a picture that really stuck in my mind, especially if there are any of you that are grandparents who have come to know the Disney film Frozen by heart after watching it over and over and over again. And there's the scene in there where the Olaf the snowman talks about finally doing what frozen things do in the summer. And so this was the Kenaston snowman. Kenaston is the blizzard capital of Canada. The Kenaston Blizzards are the local semi-pro hockey team. And it was stinking hot. It was probably into the 90s. You can see a couple of the local high school kids in the shadow of the snowman. Kenaston, Saskatchewan is warming like every place else. And as a matter of fact, in the Arctic, it's warming a good bit faster. In terms of the unusual lodging that I got, coming into Fortuna, North Dakota at the border, is a place called the Old School Center, which is an abandoned elementary school that they've turned into a bar and motel. As you can see, the bar is, as you would have it, known as the Teacher's Lounge. And if you, the places you go to stay are actually classrooms that have been carved up. What remains from the school is a bathroom that has a little brass plate on it that says boys and girls. Rounding the corner from Fortuna takes you right into the Bakken oil fields. And this is what it looks like on a hot day and on lots of other days. This is the approach to Williston, North Dakota. The Bakken field is a field that's been developed by hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And one of the byproducts of fracking is a large amount of natural gas, which it's apparently not economical to extract. So what you see are gas flares all over the horizon, here, 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 and a big one not too far from me. I was coming in on a 95-degree day, coming from the wonderfully named town of Bone Trail, and it struck me like an image out of Mordor. Now, south of Williston, Williston is a big boom town, boom and bust as the oil industry is wont to do. Right now, they're certainly in the bust phase. But south of Williston is a remarkable place. It's Theodore Roosevelt National Park. This was the place where Teddy Roosevelt came to be a cowboy. I always loved this particular picture from 1885. This is Teddy Roosevelt in tailored buckskins as he comes from New York City to make his living as a rancher in North Dakota. And I always look at this picture and I think, this dude from New York City is going to get eaten alive by real cowboys. And what happened, in fact, was exactly the opposite. Teddy Roosevelt could outlast. He even chased down outlaws for 50 miles who had stolen one of his boats on the Little Missouri River. He was amazing. Some of the same cowboys who he'd worked with ultimately joined him as part of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. The town of Medora, North Dakota, is the gateway town to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And there was where my wife, Conchetta, met me. And while I was just sleeping it off in the motel room, I was completely exhausted. Connie was out on the streets with this, my very favorite photograph. Vegas has its Elvises and Medora has its Teddys. Conchetta walked right into the middle of a presentation of a group of Roosevelt impersonators. And here you can see, first of all, this is a reenactor, of Quentin Roosevelt, who was Teddy's youngest son. And then you have Cowboy Teddy, you have President Teddy, and you have Rough Rider Teddy. It was Medora is kind of a neat place like that. Kind of strange, but wonderful. Not Medora is a place called Elk Ranch, and this is the ruins of where Teddy Roosevelt did some of his first writings on conservation. And this is what it looks like today on the Elkhorn. This is a Google Maps view of Elkhorn Ranch. You can see it, the site of Elkhorn Ranch here. This is the Little Missouri River coming through. And what you see all around it, Elkhorn Ranch is in a very small outskirts of the national park, but all around Elkhorn Ranch are drill pads. These are places where fracking is actively going on. These little, you see them as little squares on the satellite view. And all around the Elkhorn Ranch is surrounded by drilling activity. It's like Teddy is surrounded. So I wanted to conclude, I wanted to conclude by, I thought a lot about Teddy and about this place of his that was kind of a distant echo for me. So a last reading before we get to questions. Sitting in the lobby of the Rough Riders Hotel in Medora by the stone fireplace below the shelves of books by and about Roosevelt, I had a chance to consider the drill pads surrounding the Elkhorn Ranch and the planned refinery outside of town. We've been here before. He was here before. Theodore Roosevelt came west to partake of the frontier and discovered a land barren of the great animals he had come to hunt. He went back east to found a legacy of conservation. He lived at a time when the robber barons sat astride the economy. He sent J.P. Morgan red-faced on the train back to New York after telling him, "We don't want to fix it up," talking about the trusts. "We don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it." It's ironic yet perhaps predictable that the same trusts that Roosevelt broke up in the early years of the last century have reformed as the principal players in today's dominion of oil. JP Morgan Chase is the world's largest financier of fossil fuel extraction. ExxonMobil, grandchild of the Standard Oil breakup, is the largest US-based oil company. Now there's a scene in the second Terminator movie, everybody's seen it, comes to mind. The robot that is Arnold Schwarzenegger's character has just smashed the evil robot pursuing his teenage charge and delivered his signature line, "Hasta la vista, baby." Then as the kid watches wide-eyed, the metal pieces melt and begin to flow back together. And from the liquid metal puddle, the robot begins to reform. With sense of understated urgency, Arnold says, "We don't have much time." The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change would agree with Arnold. In their 2018 report, they argued that in order to keep the world at a 1.5 degree threshold and avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions need to fall by half by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. The alternatives are fairly stark. The good news is that humans won't go extinct. We're remarkably adaptable. The bad news is that Boston, Charleston, Norfolk, Jakarta, and Alexandria, both Egypt and Virginia, are in trouble from sea level rise. There's no particular upper boundary to how hot it will get if fossil fuel emissions continue. There's no reason to expect that warming will stop at the end of this century when most climate model projections stop. The average temperature of the Cretaceous period, when many of these deposits were laid down, was 97 degrees Fahrenheit, some 40 degrees warmer than today. So the global fossil fuel industry must be slowed and ultimately stopped. Despite the current oil bust, that's unlikely to happen on its own. Oil companies will do what they do unless and until governments stop them. It has always been so. Were the companies of Carnegie or Morgan or Rockefeller ever large enough for them? Yet those relentless forces have been beaten before. At the dawn of the last century, Theodore Roosevelt brought an overwhelming vitality to the national scene, a human energy that even the cowboys couldn't keep up with. With a lot of help, Roosevelt broke the power of the trusts. He faced at least as big a challenge at the start of the last century as we do today. We can do this again. So I'd like to thank you and see if we've got any questions from Mike or from any of you in the.
Yeah. Dave, first of all, great presentation. Again, a fantastic book. Dave's a pretty modest guy, but people who know him well know, one, that he writes really well. He's a great companion. I had a book editor years ago tell me that over the course of 200 or 300 pages, it's impossible to hide your personality, and that if the author has
how hard you might want to try.
Yeah, hard to hide your personality. If you have a big ego, it's going to come out in a book. If you're a cranky person, it's going to come out. If you're an optimist, it's going to come out. The thing that comes out in this book is, one, Dave's funny. He has a dry sense of humor that will literally make you burst out laughing as you read it. The story of I can't find my wallet, and he's sort of in a fog from writing all day, and the person at the window said, "Is that it right there on the counter right in front?" The way he writes it is so funny. And Dave's just a great companion in this book. And I wanted to ask you, before I get to some of the questions in the Q&A, Dave, I wanted to ask you, you're writing through tough circumstances, heat, rain, etc. And yet you have an incredible attention to detail. There's a passage in the book where you say every day riding through this ancient ocean, the Great Plains, is sort of like an orchestral movement. In the morning, you have the fog, which is sort of the woodwind softly beginning, and then the crescendo of the afternoon heat, and then the thunderstorms of the cymbals going. It's just beautiful writing. And at one point, you also mentioned that there's a part of your bicycle frame right below your head that is rusted because you've now taken like a dozen bicycle trips of 500 miles or more, and that's the exact spot where the sweat comes off your chin and strikes your bicycle. And it's just a very vivid detail. So my question for you is, as you're going through this rigorous bike ride, how do you keep notes? How do you remember? How do you record your thoughts as a writer?
It's first of all, my kids accuse me of during the day storing up dumb jokes, and there's a lot of time on the road, and you get a chance to do that. But at the end of the day, and on this ride, I was had a roof over my head each night. I was able to try to write as much as I could of what went on that day, and also to download the photos. And I put a blog up each night. And it's important in the writing process to be able to go back and put yourself, where were you that day? Tell me, refresh me on just what you were seeing. And for writing, an awful lot is in the detail of how you can, the fine detail of something that's really coming at you. It's important to have that. So each night I would put up a journal entry, and sometimes just fall over with the laptop still open at the end of the day.
And one question we have, Dave, is what time of year did you make this trip?
This was in June and July, because I remember that I was celebrating 4th of July on the plains in Alberta. So this is close to midsummer.
Got it. And I know it can get really hot up there, as you describe. One question that we have is, what's next for you? What's your next ride going to be?
Well, I'm I'm going away from writing about climate. I've actually followed some trails on the Underground Railroad with some friends. We followed Harriet Tubman's route from Cambridge, Maryland to Ontario 2 summers ago. So I'm writing about that now. The next ride is what I'm thinking about is pretty strange. It's when you look at satellite photographs, you can see where these gas flaring is happening. It jumps right out at you. And one of the big gas flaring fracking regions in North America is the Permian Basin in West Texas. So I thought, well, I like Santa Fe a lot, and I like Austin a lot, and the Permian Basin's sort of in between those. Maybe I'll go there. So I think I'm going to ride through there. The big obstacle is there's about 95 miles of just nothing but desert north of Roswell, New Mexico. And it's kind of like, I'm not worried about alien abduction. I actually may be counting on it.
See, there you go. Case in point. And if you're just joining us again, we're talking with Dave Goodrich, author of the book of Voyage Across an Ancient Ocean, here on Politics and Prose Live. And Dave, there are a couple more questions here from people watching, but I wanted to ask you to tell us, what is a pyrocumulonimbus storm, and where did you see it, or where do you write about it in the book?
Let me see if this is actually the start of a pyrocumulonimbus. I can show it to you better than I can tell it to you. When you've got a big fire going, like they had outside of Fort McMurray, you have such heat convection coming out from the fire that it can go close to the border of the stratosphere before it cools off. And fires will tend to create their own weather. And that's what they call pyrocumulonimbus, basically thunderheads that are driven by heating. And you can actually get some rain out of these, although not that much, but they are spectacular. And when the people of Fort McMurray were trying to get out of there, they were right under these clouds, and the winds get so strong that they will just with the convection that they will actually blow cinders in front of the fire, which makes it very hard to fight the fire. They always thought in their fire strategy that in Fort McMurray, the Athabasca River was going to stop any fire, but the embers just came right over the river and started fires elsewhere.
Well, we have a question sort of related to this. At some point in the book, Dave, you bring up the climate scientist Wallace Broecker. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yes.
Wallace Broecker. And there's a quote from him that's famous among all of us climate activists. And it is something along the lines that our climate system is an angry beast. And we, by burning fossil fuels, are sticking pins and needles into it. And that's haunted me ever since I first came across that quote decades ago. How did it feel for you driving through this 1,100-mile journey, knowing what you know as a climate scientist, knowing, as we see in this photograph, that the climate is an angry beast, and then being at ground level, watching these industries poke holes into this beast through tar sands production and fracking? How did that feel for you on the ground?
Well, I mean, the Broecker quote is kind of neat. I was lucky enough to meet him during my time at NOAA, and he talks of the actual quote is that we're poking it with sticks. And I would look at the drilling rigs, especially outside Williston in the Bakken, and it's like, okay, they're the sticks. That's what we're poking it with. And in some ways, it's like most climate change, it's quite invisible. The carbon dioxide from the burning of methane is going up. There's certainly some methane that's being released, but there's something in the middle of the boreal forest, and suddenly in Alberta, suddenly you're seeing these giant silver pipes come across the road. And you realize that's all carbon coming out of the earth, and it's definitely not going back in the earth anytime soon. Nobody has a realistic way of, realistic economical way of carbon capture. And that's, there is that sense of we're just keep pumping this stuff into the atmosphere. And at the same time, you have an awful lot of people whose livelihood is dependent on this. And one of the guys that took me around was quite proud of Fort McMurray and what he was doing. And he says, we produce a product that everybody uses, and it's kind of a dirty job. We're trying to clean it up. We're trying to do it as cleanly as we can, but we also have families and retirements and things like that. That said, the oil business, even before climate change, has always been this boom and bust cycle. And, we saw booms like around 2010, 2011. We're in a bust now from the coronavirus. So it's sort of this balance between the activity that's happening right around you and what is going into the air from these places.
Right. Well, we have a couple of people who are openly wondering if Dave Goodrich will please go back to government service and work in the new Biden administration. And maybe that's a conversation for another day. But one question we do have is, the book convinces us that what you're seeing on the ground is terrible and is wrecking our climate. But is there realistically a substitute for these kinds of fossil fuels in a modern world? Do you believe in briefly that we can move quickly enough through existing renewable technology to stabilize the angry beast?
The short answer is yes. When I was riding across the U.S., it's gotten to where it's hard to be in a place in the Great Plains where you don't see a wind turbine. They're everywhere. Texas is our biggest oil producer in the continental U.S., but it's also the biggest producer of wind energy. So there's the cost of solar energy and wind energy has dropped so far, so fast, that it is quite competitive with certainly with burning coal and also with burning fossil fuels. So there's a way around this. I mean, there are electric cars that are coming out almost in waves in the next couple of years, and it will be possible to gas your car up from your roof, from solar panels on your roof. So there is a way. There aren't too many applications of fossil fuels that you can't find a renewable substitute.
Well, Dave, I'm looking forward to the day when there are so many electric cars that if you're unfortunate enough to still have a gas burning car, you're going to need an app on your phone to find a gas station between here and New York. You're going to have range anxiety with your gasoline powered car, and it's going to be hit or miss of whether you can even get to New York because of all the electric vehicles versus your gas car. One question we have, Dave, is you write in the book so beautifully about a region of the United States that I know fairly well, and that's South Louisiana, where I've spent time as a journalist in the oil fields. And as a young man, you worked as a roustabout, just hired labor with a bunch of Cajun oil workers in the wetlands and coasts and offshore platforms of Louisiana. Did that experience help you relate to the fossil fuel industry workers that you find in Canada and North Dakota? And how did you have conversations with those people in the oil and tar sands fields about climate change?
Well, the first of all, yeah, Louisiana was kind of like a different planet. I mean, I remember just sort of driving around knocking on doors, and this guy says, kind of looks up and says, "When could you be ready?" And I said, "Well, I got all my stuff in the car." I said, we got a helicopter going in 15 minutes. Can you be on it?" It's like, yes, fill out forms. And that was the last I saw of the beach for like 2 weeks. And was pretty dirty, nasty work. But it also gave me the chance to almost an easy way to talk to a lot of the folks that were working in the oil fields. There were some I guess what follows from the wireline operators that were at that one bar, the Teachers Lounge, and I got to talking with them about what modern oil drilling, what modern oil extraction is like. But the thing that was different is you start mentioning the C word, you start mentioning climate, and it's almost like you can see, a little bit of stepping back a little bit of defensiveness. It says, well, climate's always changed. It's like, yep, I know. But we're kind of out of the boundaries. Yeah, but there used to be, there used to be swamp and alligators up in Alaska. Things have always changed. It's like, yeah, but we're really getting outside of that natural range right now. And the fact that when a lot of these oil deposits were laid down, it was so much warmer then than it is now, because there was, in part, because there was so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, along with orbital cycles and a lot of other things that kick into climate variability. But there is, in people in the oil fields, there's sort of a little bit of, the guys that took me around up in Fort McMurray was very kind. Took me around, and when I mentioned climate, he was saying, "Well, I thought I heard something on the radio the other day about cosmic rays. Isn't cosmic rays or solar cycles or stuff like that?" It's like, you're really grasping at it here. It's almost this, it's a certain bit of desperation. It's like, well, we didn't do this, did we? So there's that part of it. It was much easier to talk to people about the weather. How's the weather changing? What kind of things can you grow here that you couldn't grow before?
Well, Dave, that brings us almost full circle, and we're coming up on the 7 o'clock hour. And I do want to thank everyone again, Politics and Prose, and all of you who've dialed in for this. But Dave, we've gotten a couple of questions that maybe bring us full circle. We started by recognizing at the top of the event that the Keystone XL pipeline was effectively buried, ended, canceled yesterday by our new president. That was a 10-year fight. I know there are some people on this call who, like me, were arrested in civil disobedience outside the White House in 2011, August and September of 2011, to begin that campaign to draw attention to the tar sands and the Keystone XL pipeline. And it's too bad that it took us almost 10 years to get to this point, but we're here. I'm wondering, or a couple of people have asked, Dave, cancellation of that pipeline, what will it possibly do to that whole industry that you describe in Alberta in this book? Is that just an industry that finally is going to pass away, or can it somehow survive the cancellation of KXL?
It will survive to some degree because there is so much built capital equipment for the extraction of the tar sands. What it will slow down is the dramatic expansion of the tar sands. There's so much more oil sands there than they can dig or that they can steam out of there. And it's almost like that Keystone XL was the drain to this giant reservoir of carbon. And it was the way that an awful lot of that carbon was going to get to the atmosphere. And that doesn't mean that tar sands oil isn't flowing into the US. It is. There is a Keystone pipeline. There is a pipeline that they're trying to rebuild right now in Minnesota, the Line 3 pipeline that is also tar sands. And Canada is trying to build its own pipeline to the West Coast. So it's almost like there's oil, there's money there, they're trying to get it out. But what's happened is that there is a lot of oil around, and that's driving prices down for oil. It is getting more, less and less economically feasible to get it out of the ground. So hopefully what you'll see is a gradual decline, and hopefully they've got enough in bonds that they can begin the process of cleaning up in the tar sands, which will be an enormous task.
Well, on that note, which is honestly an upbeat note in that they're struggling up there in the tar sands of Alberta because of all the activism that people like us on this call, and because of all the great writing and the advocacy of people like Dave Goodrich, who wrote, again, this excellent book. I know the link from PMP, they've posted it in the chat multiple times, A Voyage Across an Ancient Ocean. This thing is eminently readable. It is funny. It's a travelogue. Dave makes the learning so easy. He sort of unspools it. You know, they say in the writing world, you don't want to load down your reader with a lot of luggage right before a long trip. And he sort of hands us the luggage gradually. He makes the learning really easy. He's a fun companion. I really encourage you to get the book. Dave, I want to thank you again on behalf of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and our friends at Politics and Prose. It's been great sharing this evening and chatting with you.
I'm much obliged, and thank you, Mike, for your leadership. We all appreciate it.
Great. And so we will see you all soon. And thanks again for joining us, and have a great evening.
And lunch, Mike?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you. One thing I will say on the activism front, February 13th, yeah, the inauguration, yeah, the election, those were big events, but nothing compares to February 13th when Chesapeake Climate Action Network is going to have its 16th annual Polar Bear Plunge to raise awareness and raise funds to fight climate change. You can learn more at keepwintercold.org. That's keepwintercold.org. If you like events like this that we help sponsor, if you like the message and the activism that we engage in across the region and on Capitol Hill, consider joining us on February 13th. Again, go to keepwintercold.org. It's going to be a virtual or virtual polar bear plunge. You can do it in the backyard with a climate bucket challenge, or you can pick a pond or a creek near your house to jump in and film yourself. It's all up to you, socially distanced, but you get friends of yours to sponsor you. Dave is sponsoring me for my plunge, and there are a lot of people on this call who are going to be taking the virtual polar bear plunge. So thanks for reminding me about that, y'all. And thanks again to everyone for joining. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.